She was 20 years old when her uncle handed her a check across the kitchen table and called it Grand's Wishes. He wrote it without looking up. $2,000. She had been living in that house for a year, sitting with her grandmother through the last of it, and now the realtor was coming Friday. And that was that. She moved into a motel room on Route 9 with her boxes and her $2,000 and a used bookstore job that paid just enough not to starve. And 2 months later, she spent $10 of what was left on a forgotten chapel at the end of a cedar post fence in the Texas Hill Country, a building from 1891 that no one had used in 80 years, with 6 rotted pews and a rusted bell, and a plain wooden altar set against the east wall that no one had moved in longer than anyone alive could remember. The county historical officer told her she'd bought herself a project without an end. But what she found when she finally shifted that altar was something the last pastor of Friedenskapelle had hidden behind it in 1943, for whoever came back or whoever came forward. If this kind of story is what brings you here, please subscribe. It costs nothing, and it means everything to this channel. And drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're listening from. I read every one. Now, back to Clara. Her grandmother's name was Vivian Doss, and she had raised Clara in a small house in Kerrville, Texas, for as long as Clara could remember. Clara's father, Vivian's younger son, had left when Clara was 3, going somewhere he never fully specified to people who never quite asked. And Vivian had taken Clara in with the matter-of-fact generosity of a woman who had decided long ago that the right thing and the easy thing were rarely the same, and that this distinction was not a reason to choose the easy one. She was a practical woman. She kept a garden and a budget and a small shelf of books above the kitchen table. A shelf that Clara had exhausted by age 12 and that Vivian kept replenishing from the library sale table, because she understood that a child who reads everything she can find is a child who will eventually find the right things, and the right things were worth providing. Vivian had specific qualities that Clara would spend years noticing she'd inherited. She remembered the details of people's lives, what they'd mentioned in passing, what they'd worried about 6 months ago, and she applied this memory with the steady consistency of someone who understood that paying attention was a form of love. She cooked well and without fuss. She was constitutionally unable to leave a task half done, which Clara had found maddening as a teenager and useful as an adult. She had opinions and offered them directly and without cruelty, which Clara had come to understand was a form of respect more valuable than tact. Vivian loved 2 things about Clara in particular. She loved that Clara read everything, and she loved that Clara paid attention to places, to the way a room felt, to the particular quality of light through a window at a particular time of day, to the stories embedded in old buildings and old photographs and objects that had been used until they wore smooth. Vivian thought this was the most useful thing a person could have, and the hardest to teach. She had watched Clara develop it, and had chosen not to comment on it, which was her version of encouragement. The cancer came when Clara was 19. It moved quickly. By August, Vivian was managing with help, and by October she was not managing without it. And Clara rearranged her bookstore's shifts and moved back into the house and learned, over the course of 8 months, the specific and unglamorous work of being with someone through the last of their life. The nights were the hardest, not dramatically so. Vivian was not a dramatic person, but there were nights when the pain was bad and the options were limited, and the best Clara could offer was her presence, and she offered it. Because Vivian had always been present, and you return what you've been given if you're paying any kind of attention at all. Vivian died in April. Her son Gerald, the elder, 51, an insurance regional manager in San Antonio, trim and careful and correct, came for the funeral and stayed 3 days. His wife, Patrice, wore a blazer to the service and spoke in a low, measured voice about how important it was for families to have these conversations about estates before the moment arrived. They had, in fact, had that conversation, or Gerald had conducted it, once by phone, in March, when Vivian was still sharp enough to disagree with him and didn't. Which Clara thought about later. Gerald came to the house 10 days after the funeral. Clara was still there, still sleeping in the guest room she'd moved into to be closer to Vivian's room, still making her way through the ordinary archaeology of a loved person's belongings. He knocked, which she found strange, since it was the house he was about to sell, and she opened the door. And he came in and stood in the kitchen in his blazer and told her the realtor was coming Friday to do an assessment and that he'd need the house cleared by the following week. He said Gran would have wanted you taken care of. He was already writing the check when he said it. He set it on the table, and she looked at it. $2,000. He said he was sorry about the timing. He did not look at her face when he said this. He looked at the check, then at the table, then at his pen, which he capped and returned to his shirt pocket. She picked up the check. She did not say anything to him, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't cost her more than $2,000 worth of dignity to recover from. She went upstairs and packed what she hadn't already packed. The motel on Route 9 cost $48 a night. She switched to a weekly rate within 4 days and spent the rest of that week recalculating, on a notepad beside the bed, how long the money would last, at what rate of spending, and what she would need to do to extend it. She kept her shifts at the bookstore, which was called Turning Pages, and was run by a woman named Elaine who had been watching over Clara from a professionally appropriate distance for 3 years, and now closed that distance slightly, adding hours without making it conspicuous. She did not call Gerald. She did not call Patrice. She called the social worker who had helped with the last months of Vivian's care once to ask about resources, and the conversation was kind and practical and did not change the fundamental facts. She found the listing in September. She'd been on the County Historical Commission's website because she'd been researching an old photograph she'd found in Vivian's house. A picture of a building she didn't recognize, stone and cedar, with people standing in front of it in clothes from a long time ago. She didn't find the photograph's building on the Commission's website. But she found something else: county historical properties available for transfer. Frieden's Kapelle, also known as the Peace Chapel, Reinhardt County, structure built 1891 by the Frieden's German settlement community. Last used for services 1943. Cemetery plot, Ruthausen 25 acres, 14 interments, adjacent to chapel. Classified as historically significant. Minimum bid $10. Transferring bidder accepts annual maintenance assessment of $1,800 and restoration obligation within 36 months per county heritage agreement. She stared at the listing for a long time. She looked at the photograph of the building in the listing. It was not the building from Vivian's photograph. But it was the same kind, the same era, the same hill country limestone, the same plain good bones. She called the County Historical Commission. The officer was named Nell Adair, 62, with the patient efficiency of someone who has explained the same provisions to the same kinds of interested parties for 20 years and has not grown impatient with them. Mostly, she answered Clara's questions accurately and with minimal editorializing until Clara asked about the condition of the interior, at which point Nell said, "It's been empty since 1943. What do you think the interior is like?" Clara said she understood. Nell said, "How old are you?" 20, Clara said. Nell was quiet for a moment. She said, "Come, look at it before you decide anything." She drove out on a Saturday in late September, taking Route 16 into the hill country, the road rising through the live oaks and cedar, and the particular pale gray-green light of the limestone country in early autumn. The chapel was 6 miles off the county road on a caliche track, a 2-lane scratch of white limestone gravel that whitened her car as she drove and threw a fine dust across the cedar brush on both sides. The cedar post fence began 1/4 mile from the chapel and ran to the gate, which was not locked, a chain wrapped, but not clasped. A formality. She got out and unlooped it. Friedenskapelle sat on a low rise at the end of the track. Stone and cedar, like the listing photograph, but smaller than she'd imagined, perhaps 30 feet long, 20 wide. The proportions of a building made for a community of farmers who would have had enough people to fill it on a Sunday, and enough sense not to build more than they needed. The limestone walls had gone the color of old bone in the September light, warm and dry, holding the afternoon. The cedar shingles on the roof had silvered and curled at the edges, but had not failed. The slope was steep enough to shed water, and the water had done its job. The bell tower at the west end rose perhaps 20 feet above the roof, open-sided, and in it, still hanging in its iron yoke, the bell. Green with age, still hanging. She tried the door. It opened. She stepped inside. The interior was dim and still, and smelled of old wood and limestone, and something she thought at first was incense, and then understood was simply the smell of a space that had been used for prayer for 50 years and then closed. A smell made of time, not of any particular substance. The light came through 4 plain windows, 2 on each long wall, the glass original and uneven in the way of old glass, throwing the September afternoon into wavering distortions on the floor. The floor was wide plank cedar, warped and split in places but largely present. 2 pews remained of the original 8, pushed against the north wall, their wood gone gray, and their surfaces furred with the particular soft dust of long enclosure. 6 more lay collapsed at the south end. Their legs failed, their planks scattered in a pattern that suggested they had gone down one by one across the decades, each one waiting until the one before it had finished. She stayed still for a moment. It was the kind of quiet that is not empty. It was the accumulated quiet of a place that had once held a great deal of sound, hymns, sermons, children's voices. The particular human weight of a congregation gathered for something, and that had kept it somewhere in the stone and the cedar. The way stone keeps cold in summer, the way an old room keeps the character of the people who inhabited it. At the east end, the altar, a raised platform of cedar planks, 3 steps up, with the altar table on top. A simple rectangle of wood, uncarved, undecorated except for the age of it. Behind the altar table, against the east wall, the reredos, a flat panel of cedar boards, painted once in a white that had aged to the color of old paper, with a painted cross at the center that had faded nearly to invisibility. The reredos was floor to ceiling. It filled the wall behind the altar completely. She stood in the nave for a while. She was still, not thinking exactly, taking account. The bell tower, the 2 surviving pews, the 6 collapsed ones, the altar, the reredos, the 4 windows, the cedar floor, the limestone walls. The cemetery she'd driven past was visible through the west window, a small plot of limestone markers in varying states of legibility, the caliche keeping the weeds sparse around them. She drove back to Kerrville and called Nell Adair from the motel parking lot. "I'd like to bid," she said. "It's a 36-month restoration obligation," Nell said. "That's a real commitment." "I know," Clara said. A pause. $10, Nell said. "Come in Monday." She was the only bidder. Ray at the title company said the transfer was the simplest he'd handled all year, which was saying something. Nell Adair stamped the commission transfer paperwork with the expression of someone deciding to see what happened next. Clara called Elaine at the bookstore that evening and asked to reduce her hours to 4 days a week. Elaine said, "What are you getting into?" Clara explained about the chapel. Elaine was quiet for a moment and then said, "I'll cover your shifts Tuesday and Thursday. What do you need?" She needed a stonemason. She needed a carpenter. She needed, as it turned out, more time than she'd planned and less money than she'd feared, because the structural bones of the building were what Nell Adair had implied, and what the limestone walls had always promised: solid, well-made, not going anywhere. The carpenter, a man named Luis Garza, 53, who had restored 3 other historical structures in Reinhardt County and had the no-nonsense quality of someone who has spent 30 years doing honest work on old buildings, came out on a Thursday morning and spent 2 hours going through the building systematically before he told her what it would cost to stabilize the roof, repoint the interior stone joints, and deal with the cedar floor. He did not tell her it couldn't be done. He told her what order to do it in, which was more useful. The bell, he said, could wait. It would ring when she was ready for it. She started going to the chapel every Saturday. She brought a broom first, then a mop, then cleaning supplies, then her own tools as she acquired them. She worked through the collapsed pews. Most of the wood was past saving, but 2 of the 6 could be rebuilt if she had the right lumber and someone who knew what they were doing, which she was working on. She cleaned the windows, she swept the floor, she set the 2 surviving pews back against the wall where they belonged. On the 3rd Saturday, she began on the altar. She was cleaning the reredos, the painted panel behind the altar table, when she noticed that the gap between the panel and the stone wall was not consistent. On the left side, the panel sat flush to the wall. On the right side, there was a seam she could get a fingertip into, and through the seam, a faint movement of air. She pressed on the right side of the panel. Nothing. She pressed along the bottom edge. Nothing. She got down on her knees and looked at the base where the panel met the platform and found, fitted into the cedar of the platform frame, nearly invisible unless you were looking for it, a small iron hook, the kind used as a door catch on old furniture. She lifted the hook. The reredo swung, not freely. The hinges were stiff with 80 years of stillness, but it swung, opening toward her like a door, and behind it was a recess in the limestone wall. 2 feet wide, 18 inches tall, 1 foot deep, cut into the stone with deliberate care, and in it, an iron box and a large book wrapped in oilskin. She did not move for a moment. If you've been with this story from the beginning, and I believe you have, please subscribe right now. This channel exists because of listeners exactly like you, and what Clara is about to open is the reason this story matters most. Stay right here. She lifted the iron box first. Heavy. Latched. Not locked. She worked the latch with both hands, and it gave with a resistance that felt like history rather than rust, and she opened it. Inside, fitted into compartments lined with what appeared to be scraps of oilskin and dried grass, the careful improvised padding of someone who had no archival materials and made do, were paper rectangles, wrapped individually in more oilskin and tied with twine. She counted them. 47. She untied the nearest one and opened the oilskin. A painting. Small, 8 inches by 10 perhaps, executed in gouache and watercolor on heavy paper, the paper browned at the edges, but preserved in the center where the oilskin had protected it. A portrait. A woman in her 30s or 40s, her hair pinned, her expression patient and slightly formal in the way of people who have been asked to sit still for a portrait and are doing their best. Behind her, through a window, the hill country, live oak and pale sky. In the lower right corner, In a small, careful hand, J. Becker, 1912. She set it down and opened another. Children, 3 of them, sitting on the chapel steps she had cleaned that morning. The steps she had walked up and down half a dozen times since September. They were looking at something outside the painting's frame, something one of them was pointing at, and the painter had caught them in the moment before they turned back, when their faces were alive with whatever it was. J. Becker, 1924. Another. The interior of the chapel itself, but different. Full. 12 people in the pews that were now collapsed on the floor, and light through the windows at the same angle she had seen it herself this morning, and the pastor at the altar in the same spot she was standing. J. Becker, 1931. She sat down on the chapel floor with the paintings around her and the iron box open beside her, and the oilskin wrappings spread out like opened envelopes, and she was in the chapel a long time before she remembered to be cold. The oilskin wrapped book was the Community Chronicle. She could not read most of it. It was written in German, in multiple hands, in ink that had faded unevenly, but she could read the dates, which ran from 1891 to 1943. And she could read the names where they were written in the Latin alphabet alongside the German script. And she could read the last entry, which was in English, in a different hand from everything before it. We are the last to use this chapel in the old way. The families have gone. But this place was built well, and what has been gathered here belongs to whoever comes back, or whoever comes forward. God willing, someone will. Pastor H. Wehmeyer. May 1943. She folded the Chronicle back in its oilskin. She looked at the 47 paintings arranged around her on the cedar floor. Outside through the west window, the limestone markers in the cemetery caught the last of the afternoon light. She called Nell Adair the following Monday. Nell came out that Thursday and stood in the chapel and looked at the paintings for a long time without speaking. She picked up the portrait of the woman in her 30s and held it toward the window and then set it down carefully. Johann Becker, Nell said. There's a note in the commission's historical file about him. A farmer. They knew he painted, but no one knew what happened to the paintings. They were behind the altar, Clara said. 80 years, Nell said. She looked at Clara. Do you know what these are? Clara said she had some idea. Nell called a woman named Vera Kuhn, who ran the Hill Country German Heritage Society out of Fredericksburg, and Vera came on a Saturday with a professional who had spent 30 years appraising historical folk art. He spent 4 hours with the paintings and the Chronicle, and when he was done he sat at the altar steps and said the collection was the most significant finding of German Texan folk art in 40 years. He valued the 47 paintings at between $26,000 and $38,000 collectively, with individual pieces varying widely depending on subject and condition. He said the Chronicle was priceless in the archival sense, which was also the most common sense, and that several universities would want access to it for translation. Vera Kuhn, before she left, told Clara about Johann Becker's practice. Every first Sunday of the month, after services, he would sit at the back of the chapel with his materials and draw a small portrait of anyone who asked, children especially, because the children loved it and their parents loved to have something made with that specific care. He never charged. He did it for 30 years, from 1905 until the community began to disperse in the early 1930s. And the people who had received those drawings had kept them, and some of those drawings were now enframed on walls in houses across the hill country, and none of those families had known where they came from until now. Clara said, he did it every first Sunday? Every first Sunday, Vera said, without fail. The man who changed Clara's understanding of what she had found was named Dieter Schumann. He was 78 years old the great-grandson of one of the Friedan settlement families, a retired schoolteacher from Comfort who had been corresponding with Nell Adair about the chapel's historical record for 11 years, and had never been able to find any documentation of the paintings or the chronicle. He drove out on a cold Saturday in November, the day after Nell called him, and parked beside Clara's Civic at the end of the Calichet track and sat in his truck for a moment before he got out. He was a deliberate man. He moved through the chapel slowly, the way a person moves through a place they have been imagining for a long time and need to match against what they find. He looked at the walls. He looked at the windows. He laid his hand on one of the 2 surviving pews, flat-palmed, the way you might greet something. He looked at the reredos, still hinged open against the wall where Clara had left it, and at the recess in the limestone behind it, empty now. He looked at each painting. She had arranged them against the south wall, each one upright, leaning at the same angle. He moved down the row slowly, holding each one in both hands, turning to the light of the windows when the light from where he stood wasn't enough. He did not speak. Clara stood to the side and did not speak either. Some things do not need commentary. He stopped at the 12th painting, a portrait of a woman. She was perhaps 60, with the kind of face that has spent decades outdoors and carries the evidence of it, not weathered in a harsh way, but in the way of a person who has lived fully in whatever weather arrived and made no particular complaint about it. Her hair was dark with gray at the temples. She wore a white collar. She was looking directly at Johann Becker, who was looking at her, and whatever passed between them in that moment, between the painter and the person being painted, had survived in the pigment and the paper for 112 years, and was still present in the late November light of the chapel. Dieter Schumann held the painting in both hands and was still. Clara watched him. She saw him read the inscription in the lower corner, J. Becker, 1912, and she saw his hands tighten slightly on the frame. Not enough to damage it, just enough to hold on. "That is my grandmother," he said. He said it the way you say something you are not entirely sure the room can contain. Quietly, with care. His grandmother had emigrated from Germany in 1901. She had lived in Reinhardt County until her death in 1957, and Dieter had been 7 years old when she died. He had photographs, a few, the kind taken on formal occasions, stiff and careful. He had not had this. He had not had her face as a real person, looked at directly by someone who had taken the time to see it. He stood there for a long time. Clara did not move. The chapel was very quiet. "He got the eyes right," Dieter said at last. "There's something in the eyes." He looked at Clara. The photographs never got it. She nodded. She understood what he meant, even though she had never seen the photographs. He stayed until the light changed, and then longer, looking at the other paintings, finding names and dates and connections she could not have found without him. He identified 6 families in the paintings, from 11 different works. He named 3 of the children in the painting of the chapel steps. His voice was steady and even, and occasionally stopped mid-sentence when he found something he needed a moment to be with, and Clara waited each time until he was ready to continue. Gerald sent a text in December. She was sanding the south pew, one of the 2 salvageable originals which Luis Garza had said could be refinished if she did it carefully, when her phone lit up with his name. The text said, "Heard about the chapel. Proud of you." She read it once. She put the phone in her pocket. She picked up the sandpaper and went back to the pew. The first Sunday of the following March, 2 months after the restoration was far enough along to invite people in, Clara held an open house. She put a notice in the Kerrville paper and a sign at the turnoff from the county road, and she unlocked the chapel at 10 in the morning and left it open. 14 people came, which was more than she'd expected and fewer than would come later. She had arranged 20 of the paintings on the west wall, the ones that had been cleaned and properly framed by then. And she read from the translated chronicle. A retired professor at the university had spent the winter translating it, and the result was a document that would eventually find its way into the state archives, though that was still ahead. And Dieter Schumann stood at the back and answered questions from two people who thought their families might have been part of the original congregation. At noon she brought out bread. She'd been baking since January, a simple loaf, not a specialty, just something warm, and she set it on the altar table and said anyone who wanted some was welcome to it. She did not explain the gesture. She thought probably some people understood it and some didn't, and that was all right. The bell rang that day for the first time since 1943. Luis Garza had serviced the iron yoke the week before and declared it sound. Clara pulled the rope herself. She had not known what to expect. The bell was old, its voice uncertain after 80 years of silence. But it rang clean, not loud, not dramatic, just clear and steady in the key of E. A tone that carried down the Caliche track and through the cedar brush and out to the county road. Someone later told her you could hear it a mile away on a still morning. She thought about the families who had heard it, week after week, generation after generation, walking toward the sound through the live oaks and the hill country light. She thought about the last time it had rung, in 1943, and the silence after, and the 80 years the bell had waited in its iron yoke. She pulled the rope 3 times. It seemed right. A community is not only the people who stayed. It is the things they left behind. The paintings wrapped in oilskin. The chronicle written in 2 languages. The names on the limestone markers in the cemetery. The bell that hung in its iron yoke for 80 years, waiting for someone to pull the rope. And it is the ones who came forward, who found what had been kept and understood what it was asking of them. And answered. Clara had walked into a forgotten chapel with $10 and a $2,000 check that belonged to someone's guilt. And she had found 47 faces looking back at her from the cedar floor. And she had understood, without anyone having to explain it, what came next. She had been 20 years old. She had spent the 10 well. The rest had followed. If this story moved you today, please subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And tell me in the comments, is there a place near you with history, a building, a cemetery, a stretch of land, whose story you've always wondered about? I would truly love to know. See you in the next one.